In 2019, during what seemed like a routine interview promoting her latest book, Diane Keaton said 7 words that made every entertainment journalist in the room stop writing. Those 7 words revealed a truth about Al Pacino that had been carefully hidden for nearly 50 years. A truth that explained the darkness in his greatest performances, and the reason he could never fully commit to anyone after her. The audio recording of that moment exists, locked away in a studio vault, because what Keaton revealed wasn't just personal heartbreak. It was evidence of something that would force us to completely reimagine everything we thought we knew about the man who became Michael Corleone. If you lived through the 70s, when movies meant something and love stories actually broke your heart, make sure you're subscribed. The secrets we're uncovering go deeper than any official biography ever dared to print. The Paramount lot in the spring of 1971 smelled like money and desperation in equal measure. The studio had bet everything on a gangster film that nobody wanted, based on a book that critics dismissed as pulp trash, directed by a 32-year-old whose last film had been a commercial disaster. Francis Ford Coppola was fighting for his job every single day, and the young actors he had insisted on casting were fighting just as hard to prove they belonged. Al Pacino was 30 years old, relatively unknown outside New York theater circles, and terrified that he was about to ruin his only shot at film stardom. Diane Keaton was 25, fresh from Broadway, with exactly 1 film credit to her name. She had been cast as Kay Adams almost as an afterthought, a nice girl to provide contrast to the violence and corruption of the Corleone family. On paper, she was playing a supporting role that required little more than looking concerned and standing beside the leading man. What nobody anticipated was the chemistry that would develop between her and Pacino, a connection so intense that it would bleed through the screen and ultimately destroy them both. The first scene they filmed together was in the restaurant, the moment when Michael tells Kay about his family's business. Coppola had blocked it simply, 2 people sitting across a table having a conversation, but when the cameras rolled, something else emerged. The way Pacino looked at Keaton wasn't acting. The vulnerability in Keaton's eyes when she listened to him wasn't performance. They were falling in love in real time, and everyone watching could feel it happening. Coppola knew immediately that he had captured something rare and precious, the kind of authentic emotion that movies spend millions trying to fake. But authentic emotion comes with a price, especially when it develops between 2 people who are fundamentally incompatible in every way that matters. Pacino was already deeply committed to the method, disappearing into characters so completely that he sometimes lost track of where the performance ended and his real self began. He was intense, obsessive, prone to dark moods that could last for days. Keaton was the opposite, warm and open and emotionally available in ways that both attracted and terrified him. She wanted connection. He wanted to be left alone with his demons. The relationship that began on the Godfather set was doomed from the beginning, but neither of them could see it yet. 3 months into filming, Pacino disappeared. Not physically, he still showed up for his call times and delivered the performances that would make him a star. But emotionally, he had retreated into a place that Keaton couldn't reach. She would later describe it as watching someone drown in slow motion while being powerless to throw them a rope. The drinking had started earlier, but now it intensified. The mood swings became more severe. There were days when he couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to be in the same room, and she had no idea why. The truth came out on a Sunday afternoon in October, in a hotel room on the Paramount lot, where Pacino had been living during the production. Keaton had come by unannounced, worried because he had missed a costume fitting and wasn't answering his phone. She found him sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey beside him, crying in a way that frightened her. Men in 1971 weren't supposed to cry, especially not men like Pacino, who played tough guys on screen. But there he was, completely broken, and when she asked what was wrong, he told her something that he had never told anyone else. The details of what Pacino revealed that afternoon remained between them for decades. Keaton honored his confidence absolutely, never speaking publicly about what she had learned. But people close to the production noticed the change in her after that day. The lightness that had characterized her personality disappeared, replaced by a sadness that would inform every role she played for years afterward. She still loved Pacino, maybe loved him more deeply after learning his secret, but now she carried his pain alongside her own. It's impossible to watch her later scenes in The Godfather without seeing that weight in her eyes. What most people don't understand about method acting is that it's not just a technique for creating believable performances. It's a form of psychological manipulation that can fundamentally alter the actor using it. When you spend months living inside the mind of a violent, damaged character like Michael Corleone, you don't just portray those qualities on screen, you begin to embody them in your daily life. The darkness you're performing starts to feel more real than your actual personality. You lose track of where the character ends, and you begin. Pacino had always been drawn to troubled, complex characters. Even in his theater work, he gravitated toward roles that required him to explore the ugliest parts of human nature. Playing Michael Corleone took that tendency to an extreme that genuinely frightened him. He was spending 12 to 14 hours a day inhabiting the mindset of a man who could order murders without emotion, who could lie to everyone he loved, who could transform from a war hero into a monster, while convincing himself he was protecting his family. The psychological toll was immense, and Pacino had no tools for managing it. Keaton watched him disappear into Michael and couldn't figure out how to bring him back. She tried everything she could think of. She organized dinners with friends, hoping that social connection might pull him out of his isolation. She suggested they take weekends away from the production, brief escapes where he could remember who he was outside the role. Nothing worked. Pacino was committed to giving Coppola the performance of a lifetime, and if that meant sacrificing his mental health and his relationship, that was a price he was willing to pay. Keaton slowly realized that she was in love with someone who valued his art more than he valued his own well-being or her presence in his life. The 2019 interview that would finally expose the truth took place in a Los Angeles studio during promotion for Keaton's memoir. The journalist conducting the interview was Sarah Weinman, a veteran entertainment reporter known for her ability to get subjects to open up about difficult topics. For the first hour, the conversation covered familiar territory: Keaton's career, her friendships with Woody Allen and Warren Beatty, her thoughts on aging in Hollywood. Standard publicity material that revealed nothing unexpected. Then Weinman asked a question that seemed innocuous on the surface, but opened a door that Keaton had kept closed for nearly 5 decades. She asked about the Godfather production, about working with Pacino at the beginning of both their major film careers. Keaton's response started conventionally enough, praising Pacino's talent and intensity, describing the excitement of being part of something that would become culturally significant. But then her tone shifted. She paused, seeming to make a decision in real time about how much to reveal. And then she said the 7 words that changed everything. All was suffering in ways nobody understood. The studio audience, carefully selected fans and industry insiders, didn't immediately grasp the significance of that statement. But Weinman recognized that Keaton had just opened a crack in a wall that had stood for decades. She pressed gently, asking what Keaton meant by suffering. There was another long pause, and then Keaton began speaking in a way that felt like a dam breaking. She talked about Pacino's struggles with depression, his inability to separate himself from the dark characters he played, his conviction that he was fundamentally broken as a human being. She described watching him descend into emotional spaces that terrified her, knowing that his commitment to his craft was literally destroying him. What Keaton revealed next was even more shocking. She explained that Pacino had a deeply traumatic childhood experience that he had never processed or healed from, something that had happened when he was 7 years old that shaped everything about how he approached relationships and emotional vulnerability. She didn't provide specific details, respecting his privacy even while exposing the general truth. But she made it clear that the intensity and darkness that characterized his greatest performances came from a real place of unresolved trauma, and that his relationships with women, including their relationship, had been casualties of his inability to confront that pain. Here's what makes Keaton's revelation particularly significant. The entertainment industry in the 1970s knew that method acting could be psychologically dangerous. Lee Strasberg, who trained many of the era's greatest actors including Pacino, openly acknowledged that the techniques he taught required careful management and strong mental health. But studios didn't care about actor welfare when those actors were delivering performances that won Oscars and made hundreds of millions of dollars. If an actor was willing to destroy himself psychologically to create great art, Hollywood was perfectly happy to let that happen. The Godfather production was particularly brutal in this regard. Coppola was fighting for survival and needed performances that would justify the studio's investment. He pushed his actors relentlessly, encouraging them to go deeper and darker regardless of the personal cost. When Pacino showed signs of serious psychological distress, nobody stepped in to suggest he take a break or seek help. Instead, they kept the cameras rolling and captured his breakdown on film. Some of Michael Corleone's most powerful moments were created by an actor who was genuinely struggling with suicidal depression. Keaton was one of the few people who recognized how dangerous the situation was becoming. She tried talking to Coppola about her concerns, but he brushed them off. The director would later claim that he had no idea how much Pacino was suffering, that the actor was so committed to maintaining his performance that he hid his true mental state from everyone. But people on the set remember differently. They remember Coppola encouraging Pacino's isolation, telling him that the loneliness and pain he was feeling would make his performance more authentic. The manipulation was subtle but deliberate. The relationship between Keaton and Pacino survived the Godfather production, but couldn't withstand what came after. When filming wrapped in the spring of 1972, both of them hoped that Pacino would return to something resembling his normal personality. Instead, he seemed to sink deeper into darkness. The character of Michael Corleone had gotten into his psychological infrastructure in a way that he couldn't shake. He was irritable, distant, prone to explosive anger, followed by periods of complete emotional shutdown. Keaton tried to help, but every attempt to get him to open up was met with resistance. The fundamental problem was that Pacino had learned something during the Godfather production that would shape the rest of his life. He had discovered that his pain and trauma, when channeled into his work, created performances of extraordinary power and authenticity. On some level, he became invested in maintaining that pain because it was the source of his artistic greatness. Healing would mean losing access to the dark emotional spaces that made his acting so compelling. It was a devil's bargain, and he chose his art over his mental health and his relationship with the woman who loved him. Keaton finally understood that she couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. She later described it as one of the most painful realizations of her life, accepting that loving someone deeply and completely isn't enough if that person is committed to their own destruction. They broke up officially in 1974, though the relationship had effectively ended long before. Keaton went on to have other relationships, including her famous connection with Woody Allen, but she never married. Friends believed that Pacino was the love of her life, and that losing him to his demons left a wound that never fully healed. When Coppola began planning the Godfather sequel, Keaton initially declined to participate. She didn't want to go back into that world, didn't want to watch Pacino descend into Michael Corleone's darkness again. But Coppola convinced her that the sequel would provide closure, that her character's arc would give her a chance to address some of the pain she had experienced during the original production. Against her better judgment, she agreed to return. The Godfather Part 2, filming in 1974, was even more psychologically damaging than the original. Michael Corleone in the sequel is a man who has completely lost his soul, who has sacrificed everything human and decent in pursuit of power. Pacino inhabited that character so completely that people who worked with him described it as genuinely disturbing. He stopped socializing entirely between takes. He ate alone, refused to make eye contact with crew members, seemed to carry an aura of menace that had nothing to do with performance. He was method acting to a degree that crossed from dedication into something that looked like mental illness. The scene where Michael lies to Kay about ordering his brother-in-law's murder is one of the most powerful moments in cinema history. When Kay realizes that Michael is lying, that he has become exactly the thing she feared, the pain in her eyes is absolutely real. Keaton wasn't acting in that moment. She was processing the actual grief of watching someone she loved transform into a monster, both on screen and in real life. The parallel between Kay's experience and Keaton's own history with Pacino is so exact that it's almost unbearable to watch if you know the backstory. After Part 2 wrapped, Keaton and Pacino never worked together again. She needed to protect herself from the psychological damage that came from being close to him during his method descents into darkness. They remained friends, speaking occasionally over the decades, but the intimacy they had shared was gone forever. Keaton later said that watching the Godfather films was difficult for her because they reminded her not just of the end of her relationship with Pacino, but of the moment when she realized that some people are too broken to be fixed by love alone. While Keaton's career flourished through the late 70s and early 80s, with iconic roles in Annie Hall and other Woody Allen films, Pacino entered a period of profound professional and personal struggle. The intensity that had made him a star in the Godfather films became a liability as he took on increasingly dark and demanding roles. Scarface, Cruising, Revolution, each film pushed him deeper into psychological spaces that were clearly unhealthy. His reputation in Hollywood shifted from brilliant method actor to difficult and possibly unstable performer. The industry gossip during this period was that Pacino was unemployable, that his demands for creative control and his intense working methods made him impossible to work with. But people close to him knew the real problem was that he was using his work to avoid dealing with the trauma and pain that had shaped his entire life. Every intense role was another opportunity to escape into someone else's psychology instead of confronting his own. The method had become a form of self-medication, and like all forms of self-medication, it stopped working effectively over time. Keaton watched this decline from a distance, occasionally reaching out but respecting Pacino's need for isolation. She later described it as one of the hardest things she ever did, maintaining enough distance to protect herself while staying connected enough that he knew she still cared. She understood that his self-destructive patterns were deeply rooted in childhood trauma that he had never addressed, but she also understood that she couldn't force him to seek help. All she could do was be available if he ever decided he was ready to do the work of healing. When the audio of Keaton's interview leaked online in late 2019, the response was immediate and intense. Mental health advocates praised her for speaking honestly about Pacino's struggles, arguing that the stigma around depression and trauma needed to be challenged, especially for men who were socialized to hide vulnerability. Others criticized her for violating Pacino's privacy, arguing that he had a right to keep his psychological struggles confidential. Pacino himself responded through a carefully worded statement released by his publicist. He acknowledged that he had struggled with depression and unresolved trauma throughout his career, and thanked Keaton for her honesty and support over the decades. He also announced that he had been in therapy for several years and was finally doing the work of addressing the childhood experiences that had shaped his emotional life. The statement was brief but significant. For perhaps the first time in his life, Pacino was publicly acknowledging his vulnerabilities instead of hiding behind the tough guy personas he played on screen. The revelation also forced a broader conversation about the costs of method acting and the film industry's exploitation of actors' psychological vulnerabilities. Several prominent actors came forward with their own stories of being encouraged to maintain unhealthy mental states for the sake of their performances. The discussion extended to how Hollywood treats mental health generally, and the ways that fame and public scrutiny can exacerbate existing psychological problems. Keaton's willingness to tell the truth about what she had witnessed became a catalyst for industry-wide reflection about practices that had been normalized for decades. The complete audio recording of Keaton's 2019 interview has never been officially released. The portion that leaked online contained only fragments of what she revealed about Pacino. According to people who have heard the full recording, Keaton went into much greater detail about specific incidents during the Godfather productions that demonstrated the severity of Pacino's struggles. She described finding him in his trailer before a crucial scene, literally beating his head against the wall to generate the emotional state he needed for the performance. She talked about late-night phone calls where he would be incoherent with despair, unable to articulate what was wrong but clearly in crisis. Most significantly, she revealed the specific childhood trauma that had shaped Pacino's entire psychological landscape. This is the information that the studio keeping the full recording locked away has prevented from becoming public. According to the few people who have heard it, the trauma involved abandonment by his father and severe neglect during his early childhood, experiences that left him with a core belief that he was fundamentally unlovable. Every relationship in his adult life, including his relationship with Keaton, had been filtered through that belief. His inability to trust, his need for control, his tendency toward isolation, all of it traced back to a 7-year-old boy who learned that the people who were supposed to protect him couldn't be relied upon. Understanding this backstory recontextualizes Pacino's entire career. The characters he was drawn to, Michael Corleone, Tony Montana, Frank Serpico, were all men dealing with betrayal and isolation, fighting to maintain control in worlds that constantly threatened to destroy them. Pacino wasn't just playing these characters, he was working through his own trauma by embodying men who faced similar psychological challenges. The performances were so powerful because they came from an absolutely authentic place of pain and survival. What often gets lost in discussions of Keaton's revelation is what it cost her to finally tell the truth. She had carried Pacino's secrets for nearly 50 years, protecting him even after their relationship ended, even as she built her own successful career. Speaking publicly about his struggles meant accepting that she had been complicit in some ways in the system that had failed him. She had watched him suffer, and while she had tried to help, she had also enabled his self-destructive patterns by not speaking up more forcefully about what she was witnessing. In the years since the interview, Keaton has spoken more openly about her own therapy journey and the ways that loving Pacino shaped her understanding of relationships and emotional health. She has described how the experience taught her to recognize the difference between supporting someone through difficult times and enabling their refusal to get help. She has talked about the guilt she carried for decades, wondering if there was something more she could have done, some way she could have intervened more effectively. Her ultimate conclusion, reached through years of therapeutic work, was that she had done the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. The relationship with Pacino also influenced Keaton's career choices in ways that only became clear decades later. Her preference for comedy and lighter material, her avoidance of intensely dramatic roles, was partially a reaction to the darkness she had experienced being close to Pacino's method process. She needed her work to be a source of joy rather than psychological excavation. The characters she became known for, quirky, neurotic, emotionally available women searching for connection, were in many ways the opposite of the emotional shutdown she had witnessed in Pacino. Her art became about affirming life and human connection rather than exploring darkness and isolation. Al Pacino is now in his 80s, still working, still taking on challenging roles that require emotional depth and vulnerability. The question that Keaton's revelation raises is what his legacy will ultimately be. Is he one of the greatest actors of his generation who happened to struggle with mental health issues? Or is he a cautionary tale about an industry that exploits psychological vulnerability for profit and awards? The answer is probably both, and that complexity makes his story all the more significant. What seems clear is that the performances that made Pacino legendary came at an enormous personal cost. The pain and trauma that he channeled into characters like Michael Corleone and Tony Montana were real, and they took a toll that he's still processing decades later. The industry celebrated the results while ignoring or actively encouraging the self-destructive process that created them. Keaton's willingness to finally speak honestly about what she witnessed has forced a reckoning with that dynamic, one that's long overdue. For the generation that grew up watching Pacino's films, who idolized his intense performances and quoted his lines, Keaton's revelation adds a layer of melancholy to that admiration. The art we loved was created by someone who was suffering, and the industry we supported was complicit in that suffering. It doesn't make the performances less powerful, but it does make them more complicated to celebrate without also acknowledging the human cost involved. There's one more thing that the complete audio recording reportedly contains, something that Keaton revealed at the very end of the interview after the cameras had stopped rolling, but while the audio was still being captured. According to the few people who have heard it, she spoke about a letter that Pacino wrote to her in 1998, on the 25th anniversary of their relationship ending. In the letter, he finally apologized for the pain he had caused her and acknowledged that his fear of vulnerability had destroyed the best thing in his life. He told her that she had been right about everything, that he had chosen his demons over his humanity, and that he would spend the rest of his life regretting that choice. Keaton never responded to the letter. By that point, she had done enough therapeutic work to understand that accepting his apology wouldn't change anything that had happened. The past couldn't be rewritten, and the pain they had both experienced couldn't be undone by words on a page. But she kept the letter, and according to the recording, she sometimes reads it when she needs to remind herself that the love they shared was real, even if it wasn't strong enough to overcome the barriers that Pacino's trauma had created. That letter, and Keaton's decision to keep it private until the 2019 interview, represents perhaps the most profound truth about their relationship. They loved each other deeply and completely, in ways that shaped both their lives and careers, but love alone couldn't heal trauma that Pacino wasn't ready to address. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go, even when it breaks your heart, because staying means watching them destroy themselves while being powerless to stop it. Keaton learned that lesson with Pacino, and it's a lesson that informed every relationship and every role she's taken on since. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the actors whose work has meant something in your life, share it with someone who remembers when movies felt important. These are the stories that matter, the human truths behind the performances we've never forgotten, and there's more to come.